Hello and welcome to the brand new series on my channel, Pan Storytime, a 17-part series where I talk you through the novel of Peter and Wendy, chapter by chapter. Chapter 1, Peter Breaks Through. In Chapter 1, we are introduced to the idea that all children, except one, grow up, and are told that age 2 is the beginning of the end. Then we meet the main family of this story, the Darlings. Mrs. Mary Darling, a lovely woman with a romantic and complex mind. She has a hidden kiss in the right-hand corner of her mouth that nobody can get. We also have her husband, Mr. George Darling, a deep man who knows about stocks and shares. And then came their 3 children, Wendy, John, and Michael. We also find out that the Darlings are quite poor, but they do their best. They try very hard to keep up with their neighbours and appearances. When their children were born, they worried that they may not be able to actually keep them, but decided to try. They got a nurse for their children, a Newfoundland dog called Nana. Before the Darlings hired her, Nana used to follow around careless nursemaids and tell on them to their masters and mistresses. They also had a small maid called Liza. There was only one of her, but Mr. and Mrs. Darling had got into the habit of referring to Liza as the servants. Another thing they were trying to keep up appearances on. Overall, they were a very sweet, very loving family. Until Mrs. Darling came across the name Peter while she was tidying up her children's minds. This is a custom she does every night with her 3 children. She tidies up their minds, putting their nicer, happier thoughts airing out on the surface, and stowing away any of the nastier, darker thoughts to the bottom of their minds so they won't dwell on them. While she's rummaging through her children's minds, she comes across things she doesn't always understand, and the word Peter starts to come up more and more often. The make-believe island of the Neverland is scattered through pretty much everyone's mind, and if you were to put every imagined version of the Neverland next to each other in a row, you would spot some similarities. Mrs. Darling asked Wendy about Peter, and began to remember stories about him from her own childhood. Initially, Mrs. Darling believed that Wendy had been dreaming the whole thing, but then they discovered some leaves at the foot of the nursery window, and Wendy said that Peter Pan sometimes came to their window and he'd play his pipes. Mrs. Darling again was not sure if this was true, but the leaves did not grow anywhere in London, and there was no other explanation for how they could have got there. Still, she decided Wendy must have been dreaming. Right? However, the very next night, Mrs. Darling, who is sitting by the nursery fire while her children sleep, falls into her own dream. She dreams that the Neverland itself has come too near, and she dreams of a strange boy. When she opens her eyes, she sees that the strange boy is right in front of her, in the nursery. The window is open, and he is accompanied by a strange light. She recognizes him at once as Peter Pan, and thinks that she has seen him somewhere before. He is clad in skeleton leaves, and she notices he still has all of his first teeth. When the strange boy looked up and realized Mrs. Darling was a grown-up, he gnashed his teeth at her. Chapter 2, The Shadow. Seeing Peter gnashing his teeth at her, Mrs. Darling screamed. Hearing this, Nana the dog comes bounding into the nursery. She sees Peter and starts to growl, leaping at him. But Peter darts back out of the window, and Nana slams the window shut behind him. At this, Mrs. Darling screamed again, thinking that the boy had fallen to his death. However, he was absolutely nowhere to be seen. The boy had left something behind, though. Nana had it in her mouth, and it turned out to be Peter's shadow. The shadow had got caught when Nana slammed the window shut. Peter had escaped, but the shadow did not have time to get out after him. They planned to hang it outside the window so Peter could come back and collect it without disturbing the children. However, it looked so much like dirty washing. Mrs. Darling did not want her neighbours to see dirty washing hanging out of her window, so instead she took the shadow and rolled it up and left it in a drawer. Then told her husband. After this, we flash forwards in time, and we see Mr. and Mrs. Darling sat with Nana in their nursery, with all of their children gone. Mr. Darling and Nana call Peter a fiend, but Mrs. Darling refuses to call the boy names. As they begin to recall the events of that Friday night when their children were taken away, we too fade back in time to that night in the nursery. The children were all playing, ready for bed. Mr. Darling had a slight altercation with Nana after an already stressful evening, the end result of which was he felt that nobody respected him as much as they respected the dog, and he took her outside and chained her up in the yard, despite his wife and his children's protests. But privately, after doing so, Mr. Darling sits alone with his knuckles to his eyes and seems to regret his decision. Nana begins to bark, warning of danger, but Mrs. Darling tries to soothe everyone's worries, puts her children to bed, and her husband leave to go to their party. And then, just as all seems well, the smallest star in the Milky Way calls out, "Now, Peter." Chapter 3. Come away, come away. The lights in the darling's nursery all go out, and for a moment there is silence. Then a light comes into the room. It is Tinker Bell. She starts searching all over the place, looking for Peter's shadow, pausing momentarily to enjoy being in a jug, which she's never been in before. Then Peter himself drops in. He makes sure the children are all asleep, and then searches with Tinker Bell, eventually locating the shadow in the chest of drawers. He accidentally shuts up Tinker Bell in the drawer in all the excitement. Once he's retrieved his shadow, he tries to stick it back on with soap, but it fails. And, distressed, he sits down on the floor and begins to cry. This wakes Wendy, who asks why he's crying. Peter claims that he never cries, and the pair introduce themselves. Wendy asks where Peter lives. He replies, "Second to the right and straight on till morning." He's making that up. Wendy then discovers that Peter has no mother and immediately feels that she is in the presence of a tragedy. Peter, however, doesn't care. Wendy then sews the shadow back on for him, and Peter crows triumphantly, shouting how clever he is. Wendy is of course offended by this, and Peter tries to make amends by saying that one girl is more use than 20 boys, and it works. Wendy offers to kiss him, but Peter has no idea what a kiss is, so he holds out his hand. Wendy then gives him the thimble from her finger. In return, Peter gives her an acorn button. Wendy learns that Peter ran away from home the day he was born, that he will never grow up, and that now he lives on the Neverland with the Lost Boys. Later on, Peter realises that Tink is shut up in the drawer, and he lets her out. Tink is cross. Wendy again tries to kiss Peter, telling him this time that a kiss is actually called a thimble, but Tinker Bell pulls on her hair to stop this happening. Peter tells Wendy that he came to their window to listen to the stories. He mentions that he heard their mother telling them a wonderful story about a lady who wore a glass slipper, but he didn't hear the ending. Wendy excitedly tells him that was Cinderella. She tells him the end of the story, and then, as Peter turns to leave, Wendy says that she could tell him and the Lost Boys lots more stories. At this, Peter wants to take Wendy to the Neverland with him, and Wendy asks if she can take John and Michael as well, and Peter agrees. As Wendy goes to wake her brothers, the children are interrupted by Liza the maid and Nana coming into the nursery. The children all pretend to be asleep, but Nana is not convinced. Liza, however, is busy and takes Nana back downstairs to chain her up. Nana immediately runs to tell Mr. and Mrs. Darling that something is wrong. Meanwhile, back in the nursery, Peter Pan is teaching the children how to fly. He blows fairy dust on them and tells them to think lovely, wonderful thoughts. And soon, all three of them can fly. Mr. and Mrs. Darling, alerted by Nana, tear back to their house and go up to check their nursery. But the window is open and all of their children are gone. Chapter 4. The Flight. We are reminded once again that there are no true directions to the Neverland, and we follow the three darling children on their journey to reach it. Soon, time is running away from them, and they're not sure how long they've been in the air for. They did have some fun, racing as they fly and snatching food out of birds' mouths. However, there were also dangers. If they fell asleep while they were flying, they would tumble down out of the air. Peter would dive down to rescue them, particularly Michael being the youngest. However, Wendy started to worry that Peter would soon grow bored and stop, because it wasn't the saving of human life that excited him, but his own cleverness. Peter himself is quite literally flighty. Every moment, he is interested in something different. He frequently goes away on his own adventures and doesn't remember the Darlings or what he'd been doing when he comes back. John becomes frustrated with Peter's showing off, but Wendy warns her brothers to be nice to him, for if Peter abandons them forever, they have no idea how to stop or how to go back, so they would just have to keep going on and on without him. The Darlings felt very alone whenever Peter left them, and Wendy became more and more aggravated that he forgot them. To try to make amends, Peter taught them how to lie out flat on a strong breeze, so they could at last sleep while they were flying. And so, with lots of ups and downs, the children approached the Neverland. We also learned that the only way anyone can reach the Neverland is if the island is out looking for you. Peter is calm when he shows the children their first glimpse of the magical island, but the Darling children are very excited. 1,000,000 golden arrows beam down over the island, and the Darling children gleefully look around at all the things they recognise from their dreams and imagination. John sees a flamingo he knows with a broken leg. Michael sees his cave, and Wendy sees her pet wolf. But then, all of a sudden, something feels very, very wrong. As the million golden arrows fade away, the children begin to fly closer together, and the darlings realize that this is an island come true. It's not make-believe anymore, and the dangers are very, very real. Peter tells them of the pirates, captained now by Jas Hook, and of how he chopped off the man's right hand, but the pirate is still a fearsome fighter who has a claw instead of a right hand. John swears that he will leave Hook to Peter if they meet in battle. As for the pirates, they know that the children are there. They can see the light made by Tinker Bell as she flies all round them, and they get out their big cannon, Long Tom. In an attempt to protect them, Peter hides Tinker Bell and her light inside John's hat, which Wendy carries as they fly. However, it is too late. There is a loud crash, and the pirates have fired Long Tom. Chapter 5, The Island Come True. In this chapter, we are taken down into the thick of the Neverland and shown a slice of how life works on the island. While Peter is absent, all the activities happen at a leisurely pace. But now that he is back, the island is teeming with life. The pirates, the creatures, Tiger Lily and her people, and the Lost Boys are all out on the island. They are going round and around the island, but they don't meet because they're all going at the same speed. The Lost Boys are looking for Peter, the pirates are looking for the Lost Boys, Tiger Lily and her people are looking for the pirates, and the creatures are looking for Tiger Lily and her people. The Lost Boys are hoping that Peter will bring them news of Cinderella, and we are introduced to the 6 of them: Nibs, Curly, Slightly, Tootles, and the twins. As they pass by, we are then introduced to Captain Hook and his crew, and then to Tiger Lily and her people. We learn that Tiger Lily is a princess in her own right, and is ridiculously brave, travelling at the back of their group, the place of the most danger. Next up, we meet the gigantic crocodile, and learn that she is looking for someone specific. We soon learn that that someone is Captain Hook, who talks to his bosun Smee while they're taking a pause in the forest. Hook talks about the moment when Peter cut off his hand and threw it to the crocodile. He says that the crocodile enjoyed the taste of him so much that she has now pursued him from land to land and sea to sea ever since, trying to get a taste of the rest of him. We also learn that the crocodile swallowed a clock, so Captain Hook can always hear her approaching because of the tick, tick, ticking. The 2 pirates then have a lucky chance, and they uncover the location of the Lost Boys' underground home. Armed with this knowledge, they return back to the pirate ship to cook a rich, damp cake to poison the Lost Boys with. Just then, Nibs comes running in, and we learn that he has seen a white bird. This bird is actually Wendy Darling. After the pirates fired Long Tom, she was knocked about in the air and left with no companion but Tinker Bell. The fairy then devised a cruel scheme and led Wendy to the Lost Boys. Down on the ground, as the Lost Boys are staring up at this great white bird, Tinker Bell tells them that Peter wants them to shoot the bird down. Tootles fires his bow, and Wendy flutters to the floor with an arrow in her chest. Chapter 6, The Little House. The Lost Boys all gather around Tootles and the fallen Wendy. Tinker Bell happily darts away as the Lost Boys realise this isn't a bird, this is a lady. They are all saddened when they realise that Peter must have brought her to the Neverland. Tootles plans to leave the group, afraid of what he had done, but then they hear Peter crowing. The Lost Boys all try to hide Wendy's body, but Tootles makes them show Peter. When Peter sees that Wendy is dead, it makes him uncomfortable. He wanted to hop away and never go near that spot again, and all the Lost Boys would have followed him if he did so. However, there was one thing left to sort out. Who was responsible? Peter took the arrow from Wendy's chest and demanded to know who fired it. Tootles bravely admitted what he had done, and Peter raised the arrow, ready to strike Tootles through the heart, mirroring what he had done to Wendy. But something stops the blow. It turns out to be Wendy. She is actually alive and has raised her arm to stop Peter from stabbing Tootles. They realise that the acorn button Peter had given to Wendy had saved her life, as the arrow had struck against this and not pierced her skin. The Lost Boys told Peter how Tinker Bell had tricked them, and Peter became very stern. He told Tink to be gone from him forever, but Wendy raised her arm again, and Tink pleaded, and Peter relented, instead saying that Tink was only banished for 1 week. The boys wondered then what to do with Wendy. They didn't want to pick her up and carry her, it would be too disrespectful, but they couldn't leave her lying there on the forest floor. So instead, they decided to build a house around her. While they are fetching and carrying items, John and Michael arrive. Michael is completely disorientated and John is in disbelief. Peter has, of course, absolutely forgotten who they are, and he gets them involved in building Wendy's house. While Wendy is asleep, Peter asks her to sing about the kind of house she would love to have, and so they listen and build it. It is a little house with red walls, a mossy roof, and roses growing all around it. Peter adds John's hat as a chimney, and the Lost Boys ask Wendy to act as their mother. Wendy agrees, and they all go down the hollow trees into the home under the ground, and the Lost Boys snuggle up in bed. Wendy herself sleeps that night in her little house, and Peter stands guard outside the door all night. Chapter 7. The Home Under the Ground. Peter measures Wendy, John, and Michael for their own hollow trees as entrances to the home under the ground. Wendy and Michael fit at first try, but John had to be altered a little. Then we get a good look at the underground home. It is one large room, with a never tree trying desperately to grow up through the middle of it, but they keep sawing it down each morning. By tea time, the tree has grown enough to be used as a stand for their dining table. Mushrooms grow in the floor, which are large enough to be used as stools, and if you dig deep enough, you can go fishing. There was a large fireplace, and the bed was tilted up against the wall during the day and let down in the evening. Wendy put up a hanging basket in which Michael, who was the littlest, would sleep. Tinkerbell, of course, had her very own room, which was in a recess in the wall. It could be shut off with a curtain from the rest of the home under the ground, and it was decorated with the most exquisite fairy tale furniture. She had a Queen Mab couch. This is the queen of the fairies in some literature. Seasonal fruit blossoms as bed sheets, a Puss in Boots mirror, a pie crust washstand, a Charming the Sixth chest of drawers, Marjorie and Robin carpet and rugs, and a Tiddlywinks chandelier. The food the boys consumed on the island consisted mainly of these: roasted breadfruit, yams, coconuts, baked pig, mammy apples, tapper rolls, and bananas. Often, though, the meals they ate were make-believe. It all depended on Peter's whim. Make-believe was so real to Peter that he could be quite full up on an imaginary meal alone. Wendy was enjoying her new role as mother, but she had noticed that time was slipping away from her and taking memories of her home life with it. To try to prevent this, Wendy would set her brothers examination papers with questions like, what colour were mother's eyes? Which was taller, father or mother? How did you spend your last holidays? And compare the characters of mother and father. Michael remembered very little and was quite happy to believe that Wendy was his real mother. John remembered their parents, but it was like they were people he had once met long ago. Wendy too was starting to forget. As Barry points out, her use of past tense. What colour were mother's eyes? Who was taller, mother or father? All of the Lost Boys joined in with these examination questions, though of course none of them got anything right. Peter was the only one who didn't join in, because he can neither write nor read. We learn next that the Neverland is absolutely crammed full of adventures. Barry then gives us a few snippets of some of the adventures that took place concerning all of the merry band, and then the author tosses a coin to decide which story to tell us in full. And the winner is Chapter 8, The Mermaid's Lagoon. If you shut your eyes and are a lucky one, in a flash of colour you may just see a glimpse of the Mermaid's Lagoon. While exploring the lagoon, we learn that the mermaids themselves are unfriendly to everyone except Peter. We are also introduced to Maroona's Rock, which is sat in the lagoon. It is a place where cruel captains would leave sailors to drown. All the boys and Wendy are lounging about on Maroona's Rock when suddenly 2 pirates approach in a dinghy. They all dive into the water and watch as Smee and Starkey drag Tiger Lily onto Maroona's Rock, intending to leave her there with her arms and ankles bound. In an attempt to help her, Peter calls out and imitates the voice of Captain Hook. He instructs the pirates to let Tiger Lily go, and, believing it's their captain, the pirates do so. Tiger Lily is released and swims away to safety. But then the real Captain Hook shows up, and he is distressed, telling his men that the Lost Boys have finally found a mother, which means they will not be so easily tricked by any of his plans. When Hook sees that Tiger Lily has been freed, he tells his men that he gave no such command. Starkey and Smee are certain that they heard their captain's voice, and Captain Hook calls out over the lagoon, asking whatever spirit it was who was speaking in his voice to answer him. Peter, of course, cannot resist this, and so they start a guessing game where they try to work out who the person behind this voice really is. After a lot of back and forth, and Peter calling the real Captain Hook a codfish, the game ends and they realise it is Peter Pan. The pirates and lost boys all launch into battle, and in the confusion and chaos, some of them even strike at their own side. All the boys had promised to leave Hook to Peter, and so the two foes meet. It's not in the water of the lagoon that they meet, however, but on Marooners Rock itself. Both of them are scaling it to take a breath on opposite sides, and Peter, seeing Hook, grabs a knife from the pirate's belt and is about to strike when he realises that he is higher up Marooners Rock than Captain Hook is, and that would not be fighting fair. So instead, Peter offers the pirate a hand to help him up. It is at this moment that Captain Hook strikes at Peter twice with his iron claw. It is the unfairness of this act which strikes Peter more than the pain of it. And because Peter always forgets, he has long forgotten his first unfairness, and his second, and the next, and the next. So this action from the pirate strikes him as his first ever unfairness, and so it hits him all the harder for it. Captain Hook himself has no time to gloat, however, as the tick, tick, tick sounds nearby, and he has to race back to the pirate ship, away from the dreaded crocodile. The lost boys and the pirates too leave the lagoon, thinking all is well. However, soon Peter and Wendy are left completely alone on Marooners Rock. They are completely stranded, and the tide is rising. Wendy tells Peter that she cannot swim or fly without his help, and Peter says that he is too wounded to do either. They are absolutely sure that they will both be drowned, but then Michael's kite flutters past them, and Peter grabs the tail of it, attaching it around Wendy's waist, telling her that it will lift her away to safety. Wendy refuses to leave without him, and at one point asks Peter to draw lots, but he refuses, saying she is a girl and she must go. Eventually, the kite carries Wendy away, and Peter is left standing on Marooners Rock, listening to the eerie sounds of the mermaids calling to the moon. As he stands there, a smile begins to play at Peter's lips, and a drum begins to beat within him. The drum is saying, to die will be an awfully big adventure. Chapter 9, The Neverbird. Peter is standing completely alone on Marooners Rock, thinking he is about to drown. The waters continue to rise until they nibble at his feet. But then something comes floating over the lagoon. It's the Neverbird in her nest. Using her wings to propel herself forwards, she works her way towards Marooners Rock and tries to tell Peter to get into the nest and float away to safety. Unfortunately, neither bird nor boy can understand the other's language, so while the bird is shouting at him to get into the nest, Peter is shouting at her, "What are you quacking about?" To make her meaning clear, the Neverbird abandons the nest and flies up into the air. Realising at last what she meant, Peter waved his thanks to the bird. The Neverbird didn't fly away, however. She stayed watching to see what Peter would do with her 2 eggs. As Peter lifted them out of the nest, the Neverbird covered her face with her wings, not wanting to see what happened to them. However, Peter didn't destroy the eggs. Instead, he looked around and noticed that Starkey had left his hat on a stave on the rock. This stave was used to mark the site of some pirate treasure a long time ago. The hat itself was watertight with a broad brim, and Peter placed the eggs into it and set it on the lagoon, where it floated beautifully. The Neverbird screamed her admiration of Peter and fluttered down onto her new nest, the hat, and Peter, of course, crowed his admiration of himself as well. The 2 friends departed, cheering, one on her new hat and Peter in the nest. He soon returned to the home under the ground, almost as soon as Wendy. Chapter 10, The Happy Home. An important change came on the island as a result of Peter helping Tiger Lily. It meant that Tiger Lily and her people were now friends with the lost boys, and they would sit at night keeping lookout over the home under the ground. Another consequence was that Tiger Lily started flirting slightly with Peter, and this infuriated Wendy, though Peter himself did not understand any of it. Wendy was having difficulties as time wore on. The lost boys were rowdy and chaotic. She was feeling frustrated over Tiger Lily, and there was Peter's indifference as well. When Peter arrived back one evening, he and Wendy engaged in some make-believe play, talking as if they were mother and father about their children, until Peter began to get worried. He asks Wendy, "It is only make-believe, isn't it? that I am their father. Wendy reassures him, but also asks, "What are your exact feelings for me?" Peter replies instantly, "Those of a devoted son, Wendy." That was not the answer Wendy had been hoping for, and she went and sat by herself at the other end of the home. Peter is puzzled by her reaction. He says that she and Tiger Lily are behaving most strangely towards him. He says that he knows there is something she wants to be to him, but he also knows it is not mother. But he doesn't understand. Neither Wendy nor Tiger Lily will give him any clarification, and Tinkerbell calls him a silly ass. For once, Wendy and Tinkerbell are in agreement. However, none of them knew that that night was soon to be known as the Night of Nights, and it would be the last night any of the Lost Boys or the Darlings would spend living on the Neverland. Chapter 11. Wendy's Story. The Lost Boys all got into bed, ready to listen to Wendy telling them their favourite story. It's the story of Wendy and her brothers. She talks about how there were once 3 children with their 2 parents and their nurse Nana, and how Nana was chained up in the yard when their father got angry with her and the children flew away to the Neverland. Tootles was very excited to be one of the Lost Boys mentioned in the story, but then Wendy began to speak about the feelings of the unhappy parents left at home with their children gone. Everyone seemed very saddened by this thought, but Wendy went on to finish the story, saying that a mother's love is so great that they will always leave the window open for their children to fly back by. Wendy ends her tale by saying that the 3 children stayed away for ages and had a lovely time, but then they flew back and were greeted happily by their loving parents. It's at this point that Peter lets out an audible, hollow groan. When Wendy asks him what is wrong, Peter tells her and the rest of the boys his own story. Peter says that once he thought like them, that his mother would always leave the window open for him. So he stayed away for moons and moons and then flew back. But the window was shut and barred. His mother had forgotten about him, and there was another little boy asleep in his old bed. This immediately panics Wendy and her brothers, and they decide that instant that they must go home in case their parents have forgotten them as well. The Lost Boys are devastated and don't want Wendy to leave, but she convinces them to come home with her and her brothers, saying she feels sure she can get her parents to adopt them. The Lost Boys are delighted and run to pack their things, but their excitement is dampened when they all realise that Peter is not coming. Wendy had assumed that of course he would come with them, but Peter of course refuses. He simply offers her his hand to shake and says, "No fuss, no blubbering, goodbye." Just as the Darlings and the Lost Boys are about to leave the home under the ground forever, there is a clash of steel up above, and they hear the sounds of a battle breaking out on the surface. Chapter 12. The children are carried off. Up above the home under the ground, Captain Hook and the pirates have launched a surprise attack against Tiger Lily and her people. This attack was completely inexcusable. Part of the rules of play, if you will, on the Neverland include the idea that Tiger Lily and her people will always be the first to attack, and they do this just before dawn. Captain Hook already knew this and chose to deliberately attack wrongly anyway. Tiger Lily and her people were trusting in the pirates' honour, and this, unfortunately, led to their demise, as the battle soon turned into a massacre. They did manage to take several of the pirates down with them, and in the end, Tiger Lily did manage to escape with the remnants of her people. It must be noted, though, that if Captain Hook had let Tiger Lily attack first, him and his men would almost certainly all have been wiped out. So, while what he did was awful, there is a reasoning behind it. Now, though, Hook's path was clear. He could get at the Lost Boys and, most importantly, Peter Pan. The question was how to get at him. None of the pirates could fit down a child's hollow tree, so all of the pirates stood wait at the top of those hollow trees, listening. In the home under the ground, Peter was telling the Lost Boys that if Tiger Lily and her people had won, they would beat the tom-tom as their sign of victory. Hearing this, Captain Hook signs to Smee, who had found the tom-tom, to beat upon it. And when they do so, there is rejoicing in the home under the ground, as the Lost Boys believe their path is clear. So all of the Lost Boys, Wendy, John and Michael, made their way up their hollow trees, unaware that the pirates were waiting at the top. Chapter 13. Do you believe in fairies? The Lost Boys all emerge from their trees and are immediately snatched and thrown through the air by the pirates and bound in ropes. Wendy gets treated differently, however. Captain Hook meets her, offers her his arm, and lifts his hat to her. Captain James Hook is very distinguished in manner and appearance, so we can't blame Wendy darling for being a little fascinated. It was then that Hook noticed something that would set a series of events in motion that would ultimately end in his own doom. As the pirates were gagging and binding the lost boys, they realised that Slightly was bigger than all of the others. It turns out Slightly had become addicted to drinking too much water while he was hot, and this had swelled him out a bit. And to avoid Peter finding out and doing things to him to make him fit his tree again, Slightly had instead been whittling away at the inside of the tree to make it bigger. As soon as Hook saw this, he knew that he would be able to fit down Slightly's tree. Without another word, Captain Hook signalled for his men to take the children back to the ship and leave him alone. Once the pirate was quite alone, he located Slightly's tree and listened intently. Was Peter asleep? Or was he standing ready with a dagger in his hand? There was no way of knowing, save by going down. The man wormed his way down Slightly's tree, and then those piercing forget-me-not eyes looked around at the home under the ground. Peter was indeed asleep on the great bed, and somehow even in unconsciousness he managed to look cocky to the pirate. It was this that made the pirate have no sympathy for him. However, he couldn't reach the boy, because at the foot of Slightly's tree there was a small door, and the pirate was too tall to reach the handle and open it. He could reach Peter's medicine cup, which was on a shelf within easy reach. All of the children were given medicine by Wendy. It was only a few drops of water, but she shook it and it was treated as a real thing by the boys. He added droplets of poison to the medicine cup, and then, in victory, climbed back up the tree. Peter slept on and on. While up on the surface, Captain Hook made his way back to the Jolly Roger, muttering about his dark deed. As he went, Tinker Bell came across the pirate and overheard what he was saying. Immediately, she rushed to the home under the ground to warn Peter. She woke Peter and told him all in a rush how the pirates had kidnapped the lost boys and Wendy, John, and Michael. Peter immediately sprang up and grabbed his weapons ready to go and rescue them, but he spotted his medicine and thought he could take it to make Wendy happy. Tinker Bell tried to warn him that Captain Hook had poisoned it, but Peter asked how on earth Hook could have got down here, and sadly Tinker Bell had no answer for this, so Peter did not believe her and started to drink his medicine. Realising there was no time left, Tinker Bell darted in between his lips and the medicine draught and drank the entire thing herself. Soon she was tumbling and falling out of the air and went to lie down on her bed. In a desperate bid to save Tinker Bell's life, Peter called out to all of the children who were dreaming of the Neverland, asking them to clap their hands if they believe in fairies. Of course, lots of the children did clap. Some of them did not, and a few hissed. But ultimately it was enough, and Tinker Bell was saved. Now to rescue Wendy and the boys. As he set off, Peter swore this terrible oath. Hook or me this time. Chapter 14, The Pirate Ship. The Jolly Roger lay low in the waters of Kidd's Creek, near the mouth of the Pirate River. She did not need anyone to keep watch, as the horror of her name was enough to keep any trespassers at bay. On the deck, her captain walked deep in thought. Hook was always concerned about good form, a notion ingrained into him from his school days, which clung to him still. The pirate soon felt a gloominess creep over him, and lamented that perhaps he would have done better if he had had less ambition. He is saddened that no little children love him, and he may not be of good form after all. But he is soon distracted by chaining up all of the children so they can't fly away. The pirates prepare to make them all walk the plank. But Hook says he does have room for 2 cabin boys, and offers the roles to any who will accept them. John and Michael nearly take the pirate up on this offer. John says that he once considered calling himself Red-Handed Jack, and Hook offers to call him that if they join. Michael asks what his pirate name would be, and Hook considers and then offers Blackbeard Joe. The 2 darling siblings nearly accept, but then Hook says that they would have to swear down with the king, and both refuse. So all of the boys are to walk the plank, and Wendy tries to rouse their spirits by saying that she believes their real mothers would have wanted them to die like English gentlemen. This does stir something within all the children, and they decide that they want to meet their fate with dignity. However, when they see the plank, they all start to shiver. Just then, they all hear the tick-tock of the crocodile. Captain Hook retreats into hiding away from the creature with his men, leaving all of the children to see that Peter Pan is scaling the side of the ship, and it's he who is ticking. Chapter 15! Hook or me this time. As Peter was making his way across the island, he passed by the crocodile, and then he noticed that she was no longer ticking. He concluded correctly that the clock inside her had at last run down. Then he had an interesting idea. Peter decided that he would start ticking, so that any other creatures who heard his ticking would leave him be, letting him pass without incident. An unforeseen result of this was that the crocodile also heard the ticking, and in confusion, she started to follow Peter. This will be very relevant at the end of the chapter. Up on the deck of the Jolly Roger, Peter hides in the captain's cabin and stops ticking. Once the noise has ceased, Captain Hook comes out of hiding and at once rallies himself to send all the boys down the plank. He tells Bill Jukes to go and fetch the cat o' nine tails from the cabin to restore some of his authority and use it on the children before they walk the plank. However, Bill Jukes enters the cabin, screams, and then they hear a crowing. Bill Jukes never returns. The pirates are alarmed and Hook sends Checo in to see what's going on. Checo cried that the cabin was pitch black and Jukes was dead. Then he screams and Peter crows once again and Checo does not return from the cabin. The crew are starting to worry and Hook threatens Starkey, telling him to go in the cabin next, but Starkey refuses, eventually flinging himself overboard to escape the captain. By now, the rest of the crew are in uproar, saying that the ship must be cursed and maybe Captain Hook had brought the curse upon them. Trying to regain face, Captain Hook sends all of the children into the cabin. He says that if the children manage to kill the thing that's crowing, then they're so much the better, and if the crowing thing kills the boys, they're none the worse. So they send all the boys into the cabin and wait. Of course, inside, Peter frees all the children from their manacles and they all grab weapons, ready to go back out. Then Peter crows. All the pirates are now terrified, believing they are cursed. They turn on their captain, and then Hook says, "No, wait, it must be because there's a girl on board." And he says they should fling Wendy overboard. However, at this point, Peter jumps out and battle commences. Of course, all of the boys have agreed to leave Captain Hook to Peter Pan alone, and soon the two enemies are facing off against one another. They are equally matched in skill and ability, but Peter manages to nip and jibe at Captain Hook, eventually stabbing him, and the pirate drops his sword. All of the children scream at Peter, "Now, Peter! Now, Peter!" But instead of killing his foe, Peter invites the pirate to pick up his sword. Fearful Captain Hook demands of Peter, "Pan, who and what art thou?" Peter's reply is only a guess. He says, "I'm youth. I'm joy. I am a little bird that has broken out of the egg." In desperation now, Captain Hook runs to blow up the powder magazine, but is foiled once again by Peter. Finally, the captain realizes that his end is near. But he does have one small bit of happiness towards the end. In their final bout, Peter kicks out at Hook rather than using his sword, and this, as Captain Hook announces loudly, is bad form. And so, a little contented now, he falls from the deck of the Jolly Roger and meets the waiting crocodile, who of course is now silent. Chapter 16, The Return Home. Peter took over as captain of the Jolly Roger. The Lost Boys act as crew, and they sail the ship over the seas to take the Darlings and the Lost Boys back to London. While they are sailing, J.M. Barrie takes us back to that nursery and lets us see what Mr. and Mrs. Darling have been doing. Mrs. Darling has left the nursery window open always, day and night. She has kept her children's things ready and never leaves the house. Mr. Darling is trying to pay penance, believing that everything that happened is his fault because he got angry at Nana, he chained her up in the yard, and therefore everything is on him. His penance is that he now lives in Nana's kennel, and Nana is treated as master of the house. Mr. Darling eats and sleeps and is taken to work and back again in this kennel, and he deeply regrets everything that he did at the beginning of the story. But one evening, Peter Pan and Tinker Bell drop into the nursery. Peter tries to shut and bar the nursery window, and then leave by the door, so that when the children arrive, they will think their parents have forgotten about them, and they will return with Peter to the Neverland. However, while he's in the nursery, he hears Mrs. Darling playing the piano and sees her crying over her lost children. Eventually, after some back and forth with himself, Peter relents, opens the window again, and flies away, saying to Tink that he doesn't need any silly mothers. And so, Wendy, John, and Michael Darling arrive back at their home, finding the nursery window open for them, and they slip into their beds, ready to surprise their parents. There is a moment of doubt, where they're not quite sure if they remember the old life as well as they thought they did, but there is great rejoicing when their parents see they have come home, and all is well again. Peter was watching this happy scene through the window. He had no desire for what lay inside, and he had innumerable other joys that no other child will know. But this is the one thing that he will forever be barred out of. Chapter 17. When Wendy Grew Up. Wendy saw Peter one more time on that night when she arrived home. He initially said goodbye, but Wendy and her mother tried to convince Peter to stay. They said that he could go to school, grow up and go to an office, but Peter naturally refused all of their offers. Mrs. Darling did make him a compromise though, seeing how saddened both he and Wendy were. She said that every year Wendy could go back to the Neverland with Peter for 1 week. Peter agreed, promising to never forget, and flew away. He takes Mrs. Darling's hidden kiss with him. Mr. and Mrs. Darling, of course, adopted all of the lost boys, but soon the novelty of being back in the real world wore off. The power to fly eventually left them, and all of the lost boys became just ordinary. Peter did come for Wendy the following year, and she spent a week with him in the Neverland. But all of the adventures that Wendy remembered were completely faded to Peter. He had no memory of Captain Hook or of Tinker Bell. The next year, Peter did not come for Wendy, but he did come the following year and never knew that he had missed one. That second visit was the last time Wendy was to see Peter for many, many years. Over time, all of the lost boys grew up. Michael became an engine driver. The twins, Nibs and Curly, worked every day in offices. Slightly married a lady of title and became a lord. Tootles became a judge. And John Darling became a bearded man who knew no stories to tell his children. Wendy got married and had a daughter called Jane. Over the years, Nana and Mrs. Darling passed away, and Wendy's family moved into the Darlings' old house. And then, one fateful night, Wendy was sat in that very same nursery while her daughter Jane was asleep in bed. The window blew open, and Peter dropped onto the floor. Peter looked exactly the same as ever, and had absolutely no idea how much time had passed. He was horrified to learn that Wendy was now a grown-up with her own child. Wendy had no idea how to comfort him and ran from the room in her own distress. In an echo of what happened many, many years ago in the exact same nursery, Peter sat on the floor and began to cry. His sobs woke Jane, who sat up in bed, and said, "Boy, why are you crying?" And so it was that Wendy's daughter Jane accompanied Peter that year to go to the Neverland for a week. And when Jane grew up, her daughter Margaret accompanied Peter in turn. The tale of Peter Pan concludes by saying that this will go on and on forever, as long as children are innocent and heartless.